So we're going to be reading verse 11 and 12. But before we read it, let me just say that these two verses, they kind of kick off an extended section in 1 Peter that is going to deal with our posture before unbelievers. Matter of fact, the whole rest of the book of 1 Peter is kind of like that, but here in this section, going through, I think it's about 3:18, it deals with us as individuals, whereas after that it kind of deals a little bit more with the posture of the church collectively before unbelievers. But because of this is a very important section, a very important book in the New Testament. Now I'm going to say something here that would cause me to be branded a heretic among some of my Baptist brothers. And I don't want anybody to take me wrong here, so I'm going to try to really be clear. But over the last many decades, there have been lots and lots of different programs to try to train us how to witness, how to share our faith, how to lead people to Christ. And for the most part, those things have kind of come and gone. Most of the ones that I'm familiar with, you don't ever hear about anymore. There are a few exceptions, a couple of exceptions, like for example, Evangelism Explosion has been around, I think, for say about 4 decades. But for most of those, they just come and they go. And so because of that, I have done a lot of searching in order to find exactly what the New Testament directly says to us about our witnessing, our testimony before others, our sharing of our faith. And so this is the line that would get half, if there was a bunch of other preachers here this morning, this is the line that would get them to walk up and walk out the door. When I say that in terms of how to go about it, there's actually startlingly little in the New Testament. Now I know that is the last thing you expected to hear me say. Now when I say that, there's tons and tons of information about salvation in the New Testament, and we ought to be being informed about how to share our faith by that. But in terms of all the programs that's come and gone, you would expect there to be these huge stretches of information in the New Testament about how to share your faith. And just to be honest, there's not a whole lot there about specifically how to do it. Like I said, there's lots about salvation, but as far as methods, not much. And this subject is really, it's very vulnerable to fads. You know, I remember several years ago when SBC came out with what they called the Faith program, and it took the letters of F-A-I-T-H, and they all stood for something, and you went, and this, I mean, they really pushed this program hard. Lifeway was involved in that, behind it, and I mean, they were aggressively pushing this on basically every SBC church in the country. And so I went and I took the training, and I went over to Tulsa, and some of us did, and came back, and it started off with a bang, lasted about 6 months or so, which is just about like every other evangelism training program that I've ever tried to start. Today, you don't hear anything about it. Don't hear a thing about it. And then they were saying, this is going to change your church. You're going to go from no baptisms to at least a baptism every week. Your church will never be the same. This is the greatest thing that has ever happened to your church, and it's going to absolutely alter the culture. It didn't. Now, there were some churches that did have some success with faith, but I kind of think that those were the kind of churches that would have had success with any evangelism program because they just thought that way. But otherwise, this is the next great thing program, you don't ever hear about it anymore. And so that's one reason why that I've actually read through the New Testament just specifically looking for instruction about how we as a church should go about sharing our faith. And it was that process that caused me to understand that as far as methods are concerned, there's not a lot. And I actually think that it says something about us that we need a program in order to share our faith. You know, if your faith is right, if your walk with Christ is right, your sharing of your faith is going to be right too. So please don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that this is not important, and I'm not saying that it's not in there. But what I am saying is that the fads, the methods, they come and go. There's something that's a lot more important than those things. Now, I'm making kind of a sweeping generalization here with this statement. There are exceptions, and 1 Peter is one of those exceptions. There is a great deal in this letter that is relative to our posture before the world, before unbelievers, and how we live our lives and things that we are to do, and even some specific things that we do. But it's not along the lines of memorizing an outline. It's more along the lines of be this way. And if we are in line with what New Testament Christianity is supposed to be all about, then sharing our faith will be a big part of that, and evangelism will happen. So, beginning with verse 11, we kick off this section in 1 Peter that is going to go into some detail about that. And I'm just going to read two verses today, verse 11 and verse 12. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. All right, so we start off by going back to this idea of aliens and strangers. Remember when we first started the book, there was a lot about that. We are aliens and strangers. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. Some of you probably recognize that line to that really old song. And that song goes on to say, I can't feel at home in this world anymore. And that's very, very true for me. Because this world is moving, and our national culture is moving further and further away from Christian values, and it's harder and harder to feel at home. And so, if we don't understand that aspect of the Christian life, then there's a lot of things about our lives that aren't going to make sense. And there are a lot of things that we experience in this life that if we can remember that, it'll be easier to deal with them. It'll be easier to handle. So we're aliens and strangers. And then he urges us as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Now, I bet you that everybody here can understand that statement quite clearly. I mean, we all know what abstain means, right? Abstain. It's just the opposite of Nike. Just don't do it. Yeah? Just don't do it. That's what abstaining means. Just don't do it. And I bet you we can probably also relate to this idea of fleshly lusts, because we all have them. He's simply saying to abstain from those things. So I'm guessing that probably the thing that comes into most of our minds when we look at the term fleshly lusts would be some kind of sexual sin, some kind of sexual lust. And, you know, it's very, very common. To me, it seems like that's really just about the biggest issue in this country today. And I can tell you that there are people that are sitting in pews in churches this morning that are struggling and having to try to deal with this problem. Probably even here. So we can understand what that is. Deviants such as pornography, sex outside of marriage, any of the other, deviant perversions that I don't necessarily even want to know all of them. Sometimes when you watch the news or a television show, you find out something you didn't even know existed and wish you didn't know that happened. So, abstain from fleshly lusts. Now, that's not the only area that Peter's talking about when he talks about fleshly lusts. I mean, there's overeating, there's substance abuse, there is an excessive emphasis on physical conditioning, and I think physical conditioning is great. It's the excessive part that I'm talking about, and that can actually become a fleshly lust, or many other things that we might not want to mention. So abstain from these. Now, John gives us a little more information about these in 1 John 2:16. He says, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world." So let's talk about those just a little bit. The lust of the flesh, we could say it's things that my body wants to provide for itself in ways other than God's will. Like, for example, since we use this already, does the body crave sex? Yes, it does. God provided a way for that to be fulfilled. But the body, the lust of the flesh wants to fulfill it in a way different than the way God intended it to be fulfilled. And most sins are like that. Most sins start with a God-given desire, but our sinful nature wants to pervert it and to fulfill that in some other way besides the way that God intended for it to be fulfilled. So that's the lust of the flesh. The lust of the eyes, did I get that in there? I didn't. The lust of the eyes is like, I see it, I want it. I see it, I want it. Anybody ever have that happen? Go walking across a new car lot and see what happens. I see it, I want it. For me, it's Guitar Center, but, that's neither here nor there. And then he says, the boastful pride of life. I want to be somebody. I want to feel like somebody. So these things, we all have them. We all have them. Sometimes they can kind of blend in together, like the lust of the eyes, I see it and I want it, and the boastful pride of life. I wonder how often when we go out and get a certain kind of vehicle that's affected us both ways. Like, for example, because of Ray's connections, I drove for 4 days this past week. I drove a 2017 Suburban to pick up kids. Brand spanking new. It had 16 miles on it when I got it. And, so people were like, wow, do you really like that? And I'm like, yeah, I like it. It's nice. But honestly, it's kind of like it's just a vehicle. It's not just driving it is not that much different. I mean, yeah, I like the gadgets. I especially like the backup camera, and I love the new car smell. But would I go out and spend $60,000 or $70,000 to have one? Kaiser would, but I wouldn't. And people were like, wow, what's it like to drive in that? Oh, it's nice. It's nice. Now, if it was a new Camaro, that might be a different story. I would get into the boastful pride of life if I was suddenly to come into possession of one of those. Yeah. Though I like it, I don't think that I would spend the money to buy a new one, even if I had it to spend. But anyway, you kind of get the idea of how these things, they work. Now, there is one thing about that Suburban that was a really blessing to me and hopefully to you too, and that is it has the Sirius XM radio, and it was tuned to the station called The Message, which is all Christian. And though I had heard this song before, I'd never paid any attention to it until I heard it a couple times driving out there, and it was that last song we did, What a Beautiful Name It Is. And so if that song blessed you as it did me, it was one of those songs that just the first time I really paid attention to it, it was drop your jaw. This is wonderful. And so if you got a blessing out of that song, you can thank Ray in his Suburban that he sent us from the dealership. All right, so abstain from fleshly lust. So even though we've talked about it, I bet you all didn't need it. You experience it every day. But what I'm wondering is if you have made the connection with the fact that the lust of the flesh, he says, wages war against the soul. Fleshly lust wages war against the soul. Like, for example, I have never yet met a man who was addicted to porn, truly addicted to porn, who was ever happy any time except when he was looking at porn. Did you know that that has actually been medically and scientifically borne out? Not just looking at porn, but that's probably the most common problem, but really any kind of this deviancy, it has a tendency to alter the chemical reactions in our brain. And I know that images that I looked at even years ago, sometimes they can come back and haunt me still, because they get seared, and there's something about the way the brain responds to that. And to get addicted means that you can't have pleasure in anything else. And that's what happens. And that's been shown to be true medically because of that you actually lose the ability to have pleasure in anything else. And so any other of those kind of deviancies. So that's one way in which the lust of the flesh, it wages war against the soul. Now, this would also be true in some of those other areas, like excessive overeating. Some people are just not happy unless they're eating, or not happy unless they're drinking alcohol, or, whatever you can add to that list. The nature of addiction and of the lust of the flesh means that you lose the ability to have pleasure in anything else besides that thing. Plus, it is a big-time depressant. It is a big-time depressant. So the lust of the flesh, it wages war against the soul. So what I'm wondering is, in our attempts to pursue happiness, are we actually sabotaging our happiness? Are we sabotaging our ability to be happy by the things that we're pursuing in this life? Most of the people that I know that have any form of addiction would like to be free of it. Jesus Christ can give you that freedom. All right, so this is the idea of our own self, but there is another aspect, and this is the one that I kind of prefaced before I really got into this passage. When I was a teenager, I was not living for God, and I had some friends that I ran around with, and those guys, they weren't believers. And for the most part, I took part in a lot of the things that they also took part in. And so there really was not much of a difference. One day, there were three of us that was riding in a car, and one of the guys began to just talk. You know how when you just wonder about things and you kind of wonder out loud? And he had some questions about God. I don't know what stimulated him to start asking these questions in his mind, and he wasn't expecting me or the other guy or any other of us friends to really be able to explain those to him. He was just kind of wandering, kind of musing. And as I sat and listened to him, it hit me like a ton of bricks that I knew the answers to those questions, because I was raised in church. I knew the answers to those questions, but I knew that I was not going to really be able to explain them to him, because I knew that my life was not in such a way as that I could be answering questions like that. Because that would have probably done more to turn him away than it would have to actually explain truth to him. And that hit me so hard that I couldn't answer the question even though I knew the answer to it. And that was one of the principal things that motivated me to try to get my life back to living for God. I wasn't a preacher yet, but it caused me to try to resume what I had left off a few years earlier and to get back with Him. Now, that is a factor that Peter brings out very clearly in verse 12. So in verse 12, he says, "Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation." All right, so that day of visitation that's the return of Christ in this context, but we'll get to that in just a minute. If I just kind of go through this verse, I see the first thing is keep your behavior excellent. And that word excellent is an excellent word. To me, if I'm trying to be excellent, that means going above and beyond. That means going beyond the call of duty, beyond the average. I am going to almost an extreme, if you will, in order to achieve excellence. Now, if you follow sports, you probably know that recently there's been a lot made of Tom Brady's diet. It's kind of weird. He wrote a book about it, and I think maybe he's even getting ready to release another book about it. But Tom Brady's diet is weird. And so there's been a lot made about that. Now, I am not a big Brady fan. Let's just make that clear right now. I'm not. But at almost 40 years old and still one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL, it's kind of hard to argue against his diet. Wouldn't you say so? Because though it is extreme, well, it's kind of hard to argue with success. And so what I'm thinking is, what if we approached our Christian lives with the same kind of extremity that he approaches his diet? How many of us would say that we do that? That we approach our Christian living to the extreme. We go above and beyond. We go as far as we can possibly imagine, even though it takes us into areas that are not common with a lot of people. You know, it's a real important thing. And that's why I like that he says, keep your behavior excellent. That's above and beyond. You know, even a lot of Christians, if you try to live your life with that kind of excellence in your Christian living, even a lot of people who are believers are not going to like that because, well, to be honest, when we try to be that, our behavior puts them to shame. It shouldn't. And I know that we don't mean to put anyone to shame if we're trying to really live for Christ in a very special way. We're not meaning to do that. But you know, and people, they have a reaction against us because we're trying to, the old saying was a goody two shoes. I don't know what they say nowadays to equal that. You know, it's like, oh, you just think you're better than we are. You just think you're better than us. And it's like, I don't think I am, but I'm trying to be. That was kind of a joke. You can laugh now. But people have a reaction to that. And so, as we try to live an excellent Christian life, going above and beyond and living for God as much as possible in every area of our lives, because of that, he says, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. But before that happens, he says, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers. In other words, because you are trying to live a Christian life of excellence, they slander you as evildoers. Now, how does that work? Well, I think that we're seeing that displayed very clearly in the media and in many areas of our culture today. I think I told you sometime back about Russell Wilson, quarterback of the Seahawks, who during his engagement with singer Ciara came out and said they were waiting until marriage to have sex. And people ripped him all across the country for that. I mean, the media people just tore him up about that statement. Now that's kind of a mild example, but it is an example of what Peter's saying by they slander you as evildoers because of your good behavior. Another example, which I've mentioned recently, is when Russell Vought was being interviewed for a government position, and Bernie Sanders asked him about an article he had written, and Russell Vought stood up for the supremacy of Jesus Christ and salvation. That was a good thing. Right? I mean, is there any other way besides Jesus Christ to get to heaven? No, there's not. And he wasn't being mean to anybody, he wasn't dishonoring anybody, and he said that all people should be given the honor as human beings made in the image of God, but Jesus Christ is central to salvation. He's the only way. And so Bernie Sanders basically ripped him because of that and told the chairman, this is not the kind of man we want serving our country. Because he believed in the supremacy of Jesus Christ. So really what he did was he took something that is good, that is right, and he said, that's evil. The same thing is true when the state of Washington, I think it's Washington or Oregon, one of those two, fines a baker $135,000 because they choose that they don't want to bake a cake for a gay wedding. You see, the things that we do that are right and good, the world says that's evil. They don't just say, I disagree with that, or something like that. They say that is evil. And it's going to continue going that direction. Everything good that we really truly stand for, somebody sooner or later is going to come along and say, not just, oh, I don't like that, but they're going to be saying, that's wrong. That is wrong. So he says that these things, keeping your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, in which they slander you as evildoers, yet that day is going to change things. Because he says in the day of visitation, they'll glorify God because of the good deeds that they saw you doing. In other words, when things are set right, when the truth be told, there is going to be a lot of eyes that are opened. And in that day, not only will we be vindicated, but even more so, the Word of God will be vindicated. The person and character of Jesus Christ will be vindicated. And all will know that that is true. So, this first little section about our posture before unbelievers has to do with keeping our behavior excellent. Keep your behavior excellent. Now, we've talked about our behavior being excellent in front of unbelievers, but you know, if you're gonna want to do that, then you've also got to have your behavior excellent when you're all by yourself and nobody's watching. That's what the word integrity means. And so, point one, don't worry, I'm not going to point two today. Point one in your posture before the world is pursue moral excellence. Interestingly, in 2 Peter, that's the first thing that Peter said to add to our faith is moral excellence. Now, I have known several people that have worked with my dad on the job. And the thing probably that I heard the most from those people is he's the same man at work as he is in church. To me, that is a very high compliment, a very high honor to speak of someone in that way. And I know that it's true because, well, I know him pretty well. And I know that it's true. So pursue moral excellence. Now, what I want to ask you this morning is, in this idea of pursuing excellence, of going above and beyond. Not just, a lot of Christians today, their question is more like, what do I have to do to get by? Or how much of the world can I do and still be Christian? But what if we went above and beyond? And where is your life in relation to the idea of pursuing excellence? Excellence in your Christian living, in your Christian behavior. And so that's what I want you to consider as we bow for prayer. Lord, I thank you for the fact that you don't pull any punches. You call sin, sin. And your word is able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. So, Lord, I just ask this morning that you make our hearts available to hear what you have to say. Make our hearts ready to hear what you have to say to us.